The Helena storm came down like judgment, snow blinding the mountains until only a single patrol car cut through the white. Inside, Officer Daniel Mercer and his German shepherd, Shadow, kept watch, two figures small against a wilderness that erases without witness. That night they would stumble upon two fallen veterans, and what followed was not a rescue, but a slow fight against silence, loneliness, and the weight of being human. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Because sometimes the smallest act of kindness, even across distance, can be the very thing that keeps someone alive. January came hard to the Helena National Forest, the kind of cold that makes trees speak in small cracks and sighs. Snow moved sideways in the beam of the cruiser's headlights, like pale ash caught in a steady wind. Officer Daniel Mercer parked on the shoulder, where the plow had given up, and darkness pressed in. He cut the engine but left the lights, and for a few seconds there was only the soft tick of cooling metal and the faint rattle of a thermos somewhere behind the seat. Shadow lifted his head first. The German shepherd had been dozing with his muzzle on Daniel's forearm, weighty in the old, familiar way that said, "I'm here." Now his ears tilted toward the window, then forward, then still. Breath fogged the glass in a dim oval exactly where his nose touched it. Daniel watched that oval widen and fade, widen and fade. It had become a ritual lately. Stop where the road bent to give a lean view into the timber, let the heater whisper at his boots, and simply look. Out there the pines wore snow like a prayer shawl, the ground unbroken except for the thin black stitches of shrubs and deadfall. The world was quiet enough to make him think of hospital hallways in the hours when the night staff speaks in murmurs and rubber soles don't quite meet the tile. He remembered his mother's last winter and how the nurse left a cup of tea to cool untouched, how he arrived half a day too late because the highway had iced and the plane had circled and circled. Some days the blame came at him like a gust. Most days it just lived in him, settled and constant, as if it had found a seat and planned to stay. Shadow's tail thumped once against the seat. Not restless, just a low, steady note, as if to say, "We're here, what?" Daniel reached for the switch that controlled the spot lamp and eased a cone of light across the tree line. It climbed the trunks, caught a hunch of rock, snagged on a hummock of wind-blown snow, and then fell off into darkness again. Snowflakes performed their little theater in that bright column, each for an instant before dissolving into the blur. The radio was quiet. Storms strangled range this far into the hills. Dispatch had advised limited patrols, and still he'd signed out with a route that would carry him up and back, past the campground turnoff, past 10 Mile Creek, where the water ran thin and cold even under a lid of ice. He told himself he was out for downed limbs or stranded engines, for the dull work of checking that closures were respected. But there were other reasons that didn't need naming. The forest, even when it folded him into its winter throat, asked nothing, and that felt like mercy. He cracked the window an inch. The cold crept in delicate and immediate. Shadow's nose twitched. He eased closer, breath bright on the air. The dog's coat had grown winter thick, black and iron gray, with a copper sheen along the ruff. Scars hid under it where duty had once pressed hard. He had the stillness of a creature that saves its strength, a patience that might be mistaken for sleep until you noticed the eyes. A drift had swallowed the mile marker behind them, and the wind worked lightly at the cruiser's door. Polite at first, then insistent. Daniel's gloved thumb hovered over the switch again. He took it off. No need to search the same trunks twice. He unsnapped his seatbelt and leaned back, letting his shoulders drop into the leather. Small habit. He touched the edge of Shadow's ear with the back of his knuckle. The ear warmed his skin through the glove. Shadow huffed once and pressed the weight of his head against Daniel's hand. Not a plea, not a command. Just a connection laid down and held. Beyond the glass, some part of the world shifted. It was subtle, like the way a sleeping body adjusts beneath a blanket. No sound, only a change in shape. Daniel lifted the binoculars from the dash. The lenses fogged with his breath, then cleared as he held them farther off. Pines layered into pines. The snow laid its pale grammar on every surface. If there had been a pattern to break, tracks, a fallen limb, he would have noticed. But the forest was whole, and that too meant something. He closed his eyes for a count of 5 and let the storm travel over him. There was anger somewhere under the calm, a thin, old thing that had learned to live quiet. Anger at time, at chance, at the ordinary cruelty of distance. It passed like it always did, leaving behind its familiar emptiness, and on the other side, something smaller and steadier, the willingness to be present. He opened his eyes and found Shadow looking back at him. The dog's gaze level and lit by the instrument panel's dim blue. "All right," he said, not loud, not for the radio, just enough for the inside of the cruiser. Shadow flicked an ear, the gesture he used to accept assignments. Daniel didn't start the engine. Instead, he unlatched the door and stepped into the storm, boots sinking. The air pinched his face. He walked around to the trunk and opened it slowly so the lid wouldn't lurch and take snow down with it. A wool blanket lived there, and a shovel, and a coil of rope that still smelled faintly of lake water from summer rescues. He checked each without knowing exactly why, then closed the trunk and stood a moment with his hands on the cold metal, letting the cold tell him where he ended and the car began. Shadow jumped down and landed soft. No scrape of nails, no complaint. He shook once, snow dusting off in a fine halo that the wind immediately broke apart. Then he sat, not at heel, not ahead, but slightly to the side. A sentry who chose his own post. His breath came slow. He lifted his nose, tasting the weather like a reader finding the first line. Daniel scanned the ditch and the pitch of slope beyond it. The angle was wrong for anyone foolish enough to try to turn around and slide off. The drifted berms at the road's edge were uniform. The storm had softened everything into sameness. Yet the feeling stayed, the needle of it, insisting, as if the land was holding its breath. He clicked the flashlight on and off to let his eyes settle, then left it dark. Snow carries light in itself. It remembers the sky even when the sky refuses to share. With the cruiser's beams behind him, the surface ahead wore a low, pewter shine. He made a small circle, boots slow to keep from breaking crust in short, startling collapses. Shadow did not follow immediately. He watched Daniel complete the circle, then rose, placing each paw with a discernment that felt almost human. When Daniel glanced down, the tracks looked like a second script beside his own. By the time they climbed back in, both were dusted head to heel. Daniel brushed Shadow's coat with his glove and worked the snow from the dog's fur at the joints. The dog gave him a narrow look of gratitude and pushed his muzzle into Daniel's palm, an old vow renewed. The heater coughed warm air and made a little cloud rise of melting snow in the footwell. Daniel set the cruiser in gear. The tires caught, then found their careful purchase along the rutted lane. They moved on, Not far. There was no hurry. The road made a slow left and then a slower right, the kind of deliberate geometry winter prefers. On the far bend, a stand of aspen wore its pale bark like bone, leaves long surrendered. The trunks shivered the way aspen do, a tremor that makes sound when everything else chooses silence. The sound reminded Daniel of paper turned in a church service, of a whole room trying to be quiet and still telling on itself. Shadow watched the glass, then the mirror, then Daniel, then the glass again. The dog's chest rose and fell in a measured rhythm that Daniel matched without meaning to. Two metronomes in a storm, keeping time. At the junction where the service road peeled off toward 10 Mile, he paused again. The sign for the turnoff carried a rind of frost. Beyond it, the road vanished into a blur that could be fog or fallen sky. He hesitated, not from fear, from respect. The forest asks you to mean what you mean. He turned the wheel and eased forward. The cruiser crept into the narrower lane, the snow thicker, the trees closer. This was where calls came from in other seasons. Lost hikers, a downed cyclist, a fisherman late to his truck. Tonight, there was only the storm stitching its white seam. Then Shadow moved. Not a startle, not a lunge. He leaned, a slow press of muscle and bone toward the passenger window, and his breath on the glass became a steady circle again, urgent now only in its persistence. Daniel felt the change like a hand on his shoulder. He lifted his foot from the gas. The cruiser slowed, and the engine's small growl softened to a hum. Snow hissed under the tires, then quieted as they stopped. He did not ask the question. He knew the answer. We're not alone. The beam from the headlights reached into the trees and gave nothing back but a pale, ongoing storm. He turned the lamp once, then cut it. There are some things you see better with the lights low. They stepped out together, and the night went on breathing around them. Somewhere far off, a branch let go of its snow with a soft, resigned thud. Daniel felt that sound in his ribs. He put a gloved hand against Shadow's neck, a touch as much for himself as for the dog. The forest held its breath, and the story began to gather. The forest did not give answers, only hints. Snow kept falling, soft as ash, disguising everything except what a keen nose could hold on to. Shadow stiffened before Daniel noticed anything. The dog's body went rigid, ears high, muscles pulled taut, as if some invisible thread had drawn him forward. Then came the sound, almost swallowed by the storm, a low growl, brief but certain, like a secret breaking free. Before Daniel could reach for the handle, Shadow leapt from the cruiser. His paws landed without a stumble, his body already angling toward the tree line. Daniel cursed under his breath and followed, boots biting into the crust of snow. The cold slapped him full in the face, forcing his lungs to work harder than they wanted. His breath rose in bursts that blurred his vision, but Shadow cut a sharp line through the whiteness, nose close to the ground, tail rigid. The world outside headlights was shadowy, yet the snow had a glow of its own. Daniel let his eyes adjust. At first he saw only randomness, gusts carving small dunes, branches dropping heavy clumps, but then he noticed the marks. Not animal, not deer. The shapes dragged unevenly, wide and shallow, like a body pulled along the ground. He stopped, knelt, and set his gloved hand against the imprint. Snow chilled the fabric instantly, but beneath it lay a story that heat or time had not erased. His palm hovered, not to measure, but to feel. It was less about the shape, more about what absence meant, the way snow had been pressed aside by something heavier than itself. He stayed there longer than he should, silent, head bowed, hand open over the indentation, as though he were acknowledging a wound. The storm continued its quiet work, laying fresh white into the depression, trying to erase what had been. But Daniel's eyes fixed hard, refusing to let the forest forget. Shadow circled back, pawing once at the trail, then looking up at him. The dog's muzzle was dusted white, but his eyes were alive, insistent, asking without sound. "Do you see?" Daniel nodded almost imperceptibly. He rose, brushing his knees, and scanned the slope. The dragged line continued deeper into the trees, disappearing where the ground tilted down toward a shallow hollow. He hesitated, the weight of his training pulling against the instinct that pressed forward. Dispatch had no signal here. He could mark the place, return later with a team. But the storm would cover everything by then. Tracks, scents, even memory. All would be flat and perfect by morning, as though no one had ever passed this way. And somewhere, someone might already be losing their last chance. The dog decided first. Shadow lowered his nose again, chest expanding with deep pulls of air, and surged ahead. Daniel followed. Each step broke the snow with a crunch that felt too loud, too careless, but he pressed on. The drag marks grew more chaotic, as if whoever made them had struggled, slowed, resisted. Here and there, a darker stain marred the surface. He bent low, and his stomach clenched. Blood. The storm tried to claim it, but not fast enough. A smear ran down the slope in uneven strokes, too wide for an animal, too heavy. The red had seeped deep into the white, dulling to brown around the edges. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Words were too easy, too thin. He lifted his gaze instead, eyes straining into the hollow where the trail disappeared. The snow there seemed deeper, weighted. The pines leaned closer, their branches bending as though they knew. He thought of nights in his childhood when silence meant his father had left the table angry, when his mother had sat staring at her hands because no one had spoken. Silence could wound. Silence could warn. And now silence held him here, balanced between duty and dread. Shadow pressed forward again, slipping down the incline with practiced ease. His body moved in measured control, every limb angled for traction, nose still reading what human eyes could not. Daniel followed clumsier, sliding a step or two, boots crunching through crust into softer layers. He caught himself against a trunk, breath ragged, heart climbing. At the bottom, the snow opened into a small clearing where wind spun in small circles, lifting powder and letting it fall again. The drag marks ended here. Shadow stood still, head lifted, ears twitching. He waited for Daniel to arrive, then stepped aside as if offering the space to him. Daniel knelt again. His glove brushed the snow until it touched something harder beneath. Cloth. Damp, cold, and wrong against the earth. He pulled carefully, revealing the frayed edge of a jacket sleeve, then let go. Fingers trembling, though the air was colder than nerves had a right to be. He looked at Shadow, whose body remained rigid, gaze fixed beyond the sleeve into the deeper drift. A gust cleared the powder, just for a breath, and the scene sharpened. More fabric, the faint curve of a shoulder, then the outline of another track leading beyond. Two bodies, maybe dragged or fallen here. Daniel didn't yet know. He only knew that the storm was not erasing fast enough, and that he had arrived at the place where waiting would mean loss. He drew one breath, then another. Behind him, the forest whispered in branches and shifting snow. Before him, the traces waited, fragile in the wind. Shadow lowered his head, muzzle nearly to the ground, and let out a soft sound. Not a bark, not a growl, but a hum of recognition. It was enough. Daniel placed his hand once more on the snow, letting the cold burn into him, then rose. Together, man and dog followed the broken path deeper into the hollow where the story had chosen to hide. Snow had a way of muting the world until everything felt suspended. The hollow ahead was quiet in that strange way, where silence became heavier than sound, where even a heartbeat felt intrusive. Daniel moved slowly, each boot sinking to mid-calf, each step leaving a print that filled almost instantly with drifting powder. Shadow guided him, lowering his head, pausing, testing the air as though he could read history itself from the wind. Then the whiteness broke. At first it seemed like lumps of stone half-buried, misshapen against the curve of the clearing. But the closer Daniel drew, the less it looked like stone and more like men. He stopped, let his breath steady, then pressed forward. Two bodies lay collapsed in the drift. One on his side, shoulders curled as if to keep something in, breath coming shallow, steam rising only faintly before the wind stole it. The other was sprawled on his back, arm flung out, snow already beginning to bury the hand. Daniel's throat tightened. He dropped to his knees, gloves digging away powder from the first man's face. The skin was pale, lips cracked, ice clinging to the beard. A groan slipped out, weak and broken, proof of life clinging hard. The second man gave no sound. Shadow did not bark, did not fuss. Instead, the shepherd lowered himself beside the weaker of the two, pressing his warm body close against the man's chest. He had done this before, in another life, trained to hold heat, to remind a failing heart that it was not alone. His tail gave one slow thump against the snow, a steady drumbeat as if saying, "Stay here, stay with us." Daniel stripped off a glove, fingers aching immediately, and touched the side of the second man's throat. For a breath, he felt nothing, then faintly, there. A fragile pulse, fluttering like a trapped bird. Relief came sharp and fleeting. There was no time to let it linger. The blood was the next thing he saw. A dark stain beneath the second man's coat, stark against the white. He pressed lightly, felt dampness already stiffening in the cold. His hand withdrew, stained darker even in the half-light. Snowflakes melted instantly where they touched it. He looked from one man to the other, both older than him. One gray at the temples, one deeply lined, their faces marked by years that did not need explanation. Military boots, jackets patched with age, not fashion. Veterans, he thought. Men who had carried something long before this storm. Shadow shifted, lifting his head to look at Daniel. The dog's breath puffed in small bursts, eyes steady. No panic, only expectation. The same look he'd given in training drills when it was time for Daniel to decide, to act, to lead. Daniel's stomach twisted. His first thought was the radio, but the weight of the storm pressed against that hope. He fumbled anyway, pulling the handset from his coat, clicking the button. Static. Nothing more. The forest swallowed every attempt. He wanted to shout, to rage against the quiet that let men fall unseen into the snow, but he didn't. He swallowed it down, let his jaw clench until his teeth hurt. Anger would not lift them, so he chose silence again. Not the silence of defeat, but of action. He pulled one man's arm across his shoulder, struggled to raise him. The body was heavy, limp with exhaustion, boots dragging deep furrows behind them. His own back burned, sweat prickling despite the icy air. He eased him onto firmer ground, propping him upright against a stump. Then he returned for the second, whose breath rattled low. This time Shadow helped. The dog pushed his shoulder against the man's side, steadying him as Daniel lifted. Together, man and dog managed where one alone would falter. When both were upright, however fragile, Daniel knelt between them. The snow gathered again, weaving a shroud as though eager to reclaim. He brushed it back from their faces, slow strokes of his glove, like a son tending to a father who had drifted too far. One man stirred faintly, lips moving. No words, only the ghost of them, gone before sound was born. Daniel leaned close, but there was nothing more, just the rattle of lungs too cold. The weight of decision pressed hard. Stay, and the snow would finish what bullets or years had started. Leave them, and they would vanish into the forest's quiet statistics. No, that wasn't him. That wasn't Shadow either. Daniel looked at his partner. Shadow lay close, fur rising and falling, keeping one chest warm while watching the other. When Daniel met his gaze, the shepherd gave a low, steady grunt. Affirmation. Readiness. They would not die here. Not if the two of them could carry weight that the world had dropped. Daniel stood again, brushed the snow from his knees. He took one long breath of air sharp enough to cut, then bent to the first man. He slid arms under the shoulders, lifted with every ounce he had, body trembling. He felt Shadow press close to the second man, guarding, waiting. The forest did not move. The storm did not pause. Only Daniel and Shadow, two figures in white, bent to the quiet task of refusing to let strangers become ghosts. And in that act, wordless, ordinary, impossibly heavy, the night drew tighter around them, and the story deepened. The first lift nearly broke him. Daniel's back strained as he dragged the man upright, the old muscles in his shoulders protesting against the pull. Snow clung to the man's coat like armor, adding weight that had no mercy. Daniel staggered once, boots sliding, but refused to drop him. He braced his legs, grunted low, and forced both of them forward. The second man lay waiting, breath shallow, chest rising in uneven spasms. Shadow remained pressed against him, lending warmth, lending presence, as though his steady heartbeat could keep another alive. So the shepherd's eyes followed Daniel, unreadable yet expectant. "We don't leave them." That was what the look said. Daniel returned, bent, and hooked his arms beneath the limp frame. This one was heavier, bulkier through the shoulders, his coat stiff with frozen blood. The smell was faint but sharp, iron beneath snow. Daniel fought the urge to gag against the bitter air. He pulled, teeth gritted, his breath turning to ragged clouds. Shadow shifted his weight forward, nudging his shoulder against the man's hip, helping Daniel inch by inch. Together they managed to haul the second body far enough to rest beside the first. The clearing looked scarred now. Drag lines, boot prints, paw marks, streaks of red turning brown against white. The storm tried to bury it all. sprinkling fresh snow into the wounds, but not fast enough. Daniel crouched, chest heaving, every muscle trembling from the exertion. The silence returned, heavier than before. Not the peace of solitude, but the kind that accuses, that asks why two men must be left to freeze under an indifferent sky. His jaw locked. He refused to answer the forest. Instead, he bent again, arranging the limp arms of one man across his own shoulders, feeling the dead weight sag against him. He rose, knees screaming, shadow circled, whining low, not distress, but encouragement, the kind that said, "Move." The path back to the cruiser was longer than he remembered. Each step dragged deep grooves through the snow. Daniel's boots slipped, knees buckled, yet he pressed on. When he faltered, Shadow returned to the second man, nudging, waiting, as though refusing to let Daniel forget there were two, not one. They made the first trip in silence except for the crunch of snow and Daniel's breath hissing between his teeth. The man over his shoulder stirred faintly once, a groan muffled against Daniel's coat. That small sound renewed him, though the ache in his spine begged to quit. At the cruiser, he lowered the man carefully onto the back seat, brushing ice from his face with the gentleness of a son tucking in a father. The man's chest rose again, shallow but there. No time to rest. Daniel turned back. The second body felt heavier still, as though it had absorbed the storm. His hands slid on the frozen fabric, his muscles gave out halfway up the slope, and he dropped to one knee in the drift. For a moment he considered it. Rest. Just rest. But Shadow barked once, sharp and urgent, the sound ripping through the quiet. Daniel clenched his jaw, lifted again, and forced himself up the incline. By the time he reached the cruiser, sweat had soaked his undershirt, despite the bitter cold. He lowered the man onto the seat beside the first, arranging their limbs to keep them from slumping too far. Both faces were pale, but both still lived. Daniel stood outside the open door, head bent, hands on his knees, breath tearing through him. The snow stung his face, settled on his lashes until his vision blurred. Shadow pressed against his leg, leaning his weight just enough to steady him. For a moment the world shrank to that. Man bent in exhaustion, dog anchoring him, strangers clinging to life inside a patrol car. The forest swirled and shifted around them, its silence unbroken. Daniel shut the door gently, as though closing the past inside. He climbed into the driver's seat, hands shaking against the wheel. Shadow leapt in after him, curling in the narrow space between the front seats, eyes fixed backward on the two lives entrusted to them. The cruiser groaned as Daniel started it again, tires spinning before finding grip. Headlights carved a narrow path through the storm. The cabin of the old forest station was miles away, but it was all they had. Every few seconds, Daniel glanced into the rearview mirror. The two men were barely visible, their faces pale blurs, but their chests moved, just enough. That was all he needed to keep driving. The storm roared, the road vanished beneath white, but the silence inside the car held stronger than the wind. It was not peace. It was weight. The kind of silence that demanded endurance, that carved duty into bone. Shadow shifted once, lowering his head onto Daniel's arm. The warmth of it spread through his sleeve, an anchor against the night. Daniel didn't speak, didn't break the moment. His eyes stayed forward, hands locked on the wheel, carrying the burden in silence because silence was all there was. The night pressed in closer, but they pressed on. And in the weight of that silence, something unspoken bound them together. The refusal to let the forgotten remain forgotten. The cruiser fought the road like a tired beast, tires groaning against ice, headlights swallowed by curtains of white. Daniel's hands gripped the wheel until his knuckles burned. The heater pushed weakly. But the air still held the raw bite of January. Behind him, the two men slumped together, breaths uneven, shallow, but still present. That was enough, for now. Shadow stood braced in the narrow space between front seats, ears twitching with every shift of wind against the cruiser. His body swayed easily with the turns, tail held low but steady, like he had done this journey 100 times before. Every so often, he glanced back at the men, then at Daniel. Then pressed his muzzle into Daniel's arm, grounding him in silence. The forest road cut toward 10 Mile Creek. Daniel knew the path well. He had come here as a boy with his father, fishing in warmer seasons, learning patience beside cold water. There was an old ranger's cabin near the bend, half forgotten, still standing, though no one kept it. He prayed it hadn't collapsed beneath the years. Tonight, it would have to do, and when the turn appeared, it was barely visible, just a sag in the trees, a dip in the snow. He eased the cruiser down, tires biting, chassis groaning. Branches scraped the roof with brittle fingers. Then, faint through the snow, he saw it. A square of darkness against the pale, the outline of logs stacked rough, a chimney tilting but intact. Relief came not as a shout, but as a quiet exhale that fogged the glass. He stopped close to the porch, cutting the engine. The sudden stillness roared in his ears. No hum, no tires, only wind and his own pulse. He stepped out, boots sinking, the cold wrapping hard around his chest. Shadow leapt down beside him, paws landing soft, ears forward, nose testing the air. Together they approached the cabin. The door yielded after a hard shove, snow spilling in from where it had wedged against the frame. Inside, the dark smelled of dust and pine resin, stale but not rotten. A stone hearth crouched at one end, cold but whole. A stack of warped logs leaned against the wall. It could work. Daniel returned to the cruiser. One by one, he lifted the men again, dragging, carrying, half-hauling their limp weight through the snow and into the cabin. Shadow moved with him, circling, nudging, offering his body as brace when Daniel faltered. Sweat slicked his back under layers of wool. But he did not stop until both men lay inside, near the hearth, still alive beneath the thin crust of snow that clung to their clothes. He worked quickly. Logs into the hearth, kindling snapped, matches striking against the box until flame caught. The fire built slowly, then all at once leaping to life, throwing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Heat came gradual but sure, curling the air, promising a chance. Daniel pulled blankets from the cruiser, tucking them over the men. Their faces slackened slightly, as if some hidden muscle had released. He crouched near one, brushing ice from the beard with the edge of his glove, careful, almost reverent. From the corner of his eye, he caught Shadow. The shepherd had stretched out close to Raymond, the older, gaunter man, pressing his side along the veteran's ribs, muzzle resting lightly against the man's leg. The dog's body heat bled into him, silent, loyal, wordless. Daniel watched, chest tight, remembering nights when his own grief had felt like that, unbearable until Shadow had leaned against him, insisting without words, "Stay." The room grew warmer. Condensation dripped from the rafters. tapping soft against the floorboards. Daniel moved to the small iron kettle he had found on a shelf, poured in snow, set it above the flames. Steam rose slowly, filling the cabin with the faint smell of heated iron. When the water boiled, he poured it into the only clean vessel he had, an old enamel mug, its rim chipped. From his pocket, he found the last of the coffee from his thermos, poured the bitter grounds in, let them swirl. He carried it to Elliot, the heavier of the two, whose lips were cracked and bleeding. Daniel slid a hand beneath his head, raised him carefully, pressed the rim to his mouth. Most spilled down his chin, but a little slid past his lips. Elliot swallowed with a faint twitch of throat. The moment was small, almost invisible, but Daniel felt it lodge deep in his chest. A swallow, a will, however fragile, to remain. He set the mug aside, then returned to the fire, feeding it until it glowed steady. He leaned back on his heels, watching flames climb. The light painted his face in orange, hollowing the lines, making him look older than his 33 years. He thought of his mother's hands folding blankets in a hospital room, of his father stacking wood before winter storms, of quiet care that asked for nothing but gave everything. Behind him, shadow shifted. The shepherd's eyes reflected the firelight, twin embers watchful, unblinking. His tail tapped once, slow and steady, against the floorboards. Daniel reached over, found the mug half full, and carried it back to the fire. He warmed it again, then returned. This time he crouched beside Raymond, lifted the man's head, and offered the drink. The lips parted faintly. A few drops slid in. Raymond coughed weakly, then drew a deeper breath, chest rising higher than before. Daniel's own lungs loosened. He sat back, weary, hands dangling between his knees. The storm outside battered the shutters, but in here, warmth had begun to push back. He let himself notice it, the small circle of firelight, the two battered lives wrapped in blankets, the steady presence of a dog stretched along the floorboards. A cabin meant for no one had become a refuge. The world had tried to erase these men with snow, but now, for tonight, they were held. Daniel reached for the mug once more, not for them, but for himself. He drank the bitter coffee, felt it burn his throat, and closed his eyes a moment. Shadow lifted his head, pressed his muzzle into Daniel's palm, and left it there. Daniel let the weight settle, the warmth seep. For a long time, neither moved. The silence in the cabin was no longer accusation. It had changed, softened, grown into something almost sacred. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, life clung stubbornly on. The fire had worked its slow magic through the night. Smoke curled lazily in the rafters, and the thick air inside the cabin carried both the tang of burning pine and the faint iron of blood. Daniel sat in the wooden chair he had dragged close to the hearth, elbows braced on his knees, eyes fixed not on the flames, but on the men lying beneath blankets. He had dozed once or twice, but never fully. Each time his head dipped, shadow would shift, brush against his leg, and pull him back into waking. The men began to stir when dawn was still only a pale smear behind the shutters. Raymond moved first, a shallow twitch beneath the wool blanket, then a slow effort to lift his head. His face, lean and hollowed, looked carved from stone softened only by exhaustion. He blinked, eyes clouded until they found the fire, and his lips parted. The sound he made was rough, half breath, half thought. War never ends. His voice cracked under the weight of memory, not volume. Daniel heard but did not answer. He only reached for the enamel mug resting on the hearthstone, filled again with warm water, and placed it gently near Raymond's hand. The old soldier's fingers fumbled, trembled, then closed around it. A sip, too, water trickling down the edge of his beard, but he drank. Elliot woke less gently. His body jerked as though his mind had mistaken warmth for attack. He tried to push himself upright, and his bad leg buckled beneath him. The cry he stifled was guttural, raw, and he collapsed back onto the cot Daniel had dragged together from two broken benches. He pressed his hand hard into his thigh, eyes squeezed shut. Daniel moved to him but did not touch. He only pulled the chair closer and placed a canteen within reach. Elliot opened his eyes, caught the gesture, and something flared behind them. Anger, pride, shame tangled in one glance. He turned away, jaw tight, but after a long silence his hand snatched the canteen, brought it shakily to his lips. Shadow crossed the room then, slow and deliberate, paws soft against the old floorboards. The shepherd circled once before lowering himself at Elliot's side. Without asking, without waiting, he rested his head across the veteran's leg, the one scarred, the one that trembled under pain. Elliot froze. His hand hovered, uncertain, then dropped into the dog's fur. A shudder traveled through him, and to Daniel's surprise, wetness lined his lashes. He whispered nothing, but the tears told what words could not. Daniel turned back to the fire, giving them the dignity of not being witnessed too closely. He took up the poker, nudged a log, watched sparks leap. His own throat tightened with a recognition he did not name, the knowledge that silence between men can sometimes be heavier than speech, and sometimes more merciful. Time passed in small increments. The drip of meltwater from the roof, the pop of sap in the flames, the slow deepening of breath from the two men as warmth did its work. Daniel fetched snow in a pot, melted it, and dropped a few shreds of dried jerky in to soften. The smell was plain, meager, but food nonetheless. He ladled portions into the same chipped mug, offering spoonfuls one at a time. Raymond accepted with a faint nod. Elliot resisted until hunger overtook pride, then ate with small, angry jerks of the spoon, as though fighting even this act of survival. Daniel said little. His words, when they came, were simple. Here, drink, slow. Nothing more. When the meal was done, the cabin settled again into quiet. Outside, the wind had calmed, but snow still fell, thicker flakes that drifted steady as ash. Daniel could feel the weight of the storm pressing against the walls, trying to come in. Inside, another kind of weight pressed, the heaviness of wounds carried long before last night. Raymond dozed with his hands folded across his chest, the mug still balanced nearby. Elliot stared at the rafters, eyes wide, mouth set in a hard line. Daniel remained by the fire, shoulders hunched, hands clasped. Shadow stayed between them all, tail curled, ears twitching at every sigh of the wind. Daniel thought of his father then, how he had sat like that in silence after long days at the mill, not talking about pain, but letting it sit in the room like smoke. He thought of his mother, who had pressed cool cloths to fevered brows in the hospital ward without asking for thanks. He wondered if these men, strangers in uniform coats, carried ghosts the way he carried his. He suspected they did. The cabin became a vessel for it all. Grief unspoken, scars shown only by trembling hands or a leg that would never bend right. Daniel felt it soak into the walls as the fire burned low. And yet, amid the heaviness, there was something else. Small, fragile, undeniable. The warmth of a dog's head on a broken limb. The bitter comfort of coffee passed from one stranger to another. The act of staying, when leaving might have been easier. Shadow lifted his head once, glanced at Daniel, then pressed closer against Elliot's side. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if giving the cabin permission to hold it all. Outside, the storm went on. Inside, the old wounds had surfaced, not healed, not yet, but seen, and for the first time in a long while, not carried alone. The storm returned with fury after dusk. Wind shook the shutters until nails squealed against wood, and snow lashed sideways against the cabin wall. Daniel had braced them with old boards he found stacked by the porch, but still the whole structure shivered like an old man in fever. Inside, the fire glowed steady, though every few minutes Daniel rose to feed it, unwilling to let the room fall to cold again. Raymond and Elliot lay bundled near the hearth, their faces slack with exhaustion, though sleep never seemed deep. They drifted in and out, pulled awake by pain or memory, their breaths uneven. Shadow moved between them, never resting long in one place, stretching his body across one chest and then the other, as though guarding each heartbeat in turn. Daniel sat in the armchair pushed close to the fire. His rifle leaned within reach against the wall, a habit more than a need, but habit comforted him. He had pulled off his gloves, fingers raw, nails lined with dirt and blood. He rubbed them together for warmth, then pressed them against his forehead, closing his eyes. Behind the lids, images flickered, the sterile white of hospital sheets, the way his mother's hand had slipped from his, the phone call that came too late to let him say goodbye to his father. The cabin was filled with silence, but not the gentle kind. It was a silence that pressed, thick, crowding him with old regrets. He stared at the flames again, watching them gnaw logs to embers, and thought of how easily everything consumed itself in time. Shadow lifted his head from where he lay draped over Elliot's leg. The shepherd padded across the floor and pressed his weight against Daniel's knee, the familiar touch that always broke the tide of memory before it drowned him. Daniel's hand fell into the fur without thought, fingers curling, holding on. He whispered nothing, just exhaled through tight teeth. Shadow leaned harder, his muzzle heavy on Daniel's palm, insisting without words, "Here, stay here." The night stretched. Each creak of the rafters carried tension. Daniel rose often to check the men, adjusting blankets, tilting heads to keep airways clear. He poured more hot water into the enamel mug, coaxing sips past cracked lips, wiping the spill with the edge of his sleeve. It was work without glory, but each small act mattered. Each act defied the storm outside. Once Raymond woke with a start, eyes wild, fists trembling, as though clutching a rifle unseen. He muttered names Daniel didn't recognize, fragments of orders, broken by coughing. Daniel crouched beside him, laid a hand lightly on his shoulder, not to restrain, only to anchor. The touch drew him back. His eyes cleared enough to see the fire, the cabin, the safety. His breathing slowed. He sagged into the blanket again, whispering nothing more. Later, Elliot tried to rise. His pride fought the weakness of his body. He swung his good leg out, braced an elbow, pushed, and collapsed with a hiss of pain. Daniel moved quickly, steadying him without scolding. He pulled the chair close, set a canteen within reach, and sat beside him in quiet company. Elliot's jaw stayed clenched, eyes fixed on the flames, but after long minutes, his hand reached out. Not to Daniel, but to Shadow, who had already pressed close. The shepherd lifted his head onto the man's thigh once more. This time, Elliot didn't resist. His hand sank into thick fur, trembling, then stilled. Hours passed like that, fragments of care, fragments of memory, fragments of presence. At one point, Daniel leaned back in the chair, Shadow's head still heavy against his boot. The fire threw light that flickered against the walls, painting the cabin with restless shadows. Daniel's own shadow stretched tall across the ceiling, distorted, wavering, like a man too large for his skin. He closed his eyes, asking silently if he was enough, for these men, for himself, for the ghosts he carried. The question lingered without answer. Snow battered the cabin harder. The logs groaned, wind moaned through chinks, yet inside, warmth persisted, a fragile, stubborn warmth. Daniel kept feeding it, kept watch with eyes heavy but unyielding. He knew if he let himself drift too long, the fire might falter, and so would they. Responsibility anchored him upright when weariness wanted to fold him. When midnight came, he rose again. He laid another log on the embers, stirred until sparks leapt, then sat close once more. His hand rested on Shadow's back. The shepherd turned his head just enough to glance at him, eyes reflecting firelight, steady and sure. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. Not peace, not yet, but a thread of it, enough to hold through the storm. The night remained long. The storm raged. Inside the cabin, breaths stuttered but continued, flames flickered but endured, and silence pressed but did not win. Man and dog carried it together, the weight of strangers, the weight of memory. The weight of choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. By dawn, Daniel's eyes burned, his body sagged, but he was still there, still upright, Shadow still at his side. The storm had not ended, but it had not taken them either, and that was enough for one long winter night. When morning finally came, it did not arrive with brightness, but with a softer dimness, a thinning of the storm. The shutters still rattled, but less fiercely, and the air inside the cabin carried a faint shift, lighter, not so suffocating. Daniel noticed it first by the way the flames settled, burning steady rather than fighting every draft. He rose stiffly from the chair, back aching, knees protesting, and crossed to the narrow window. He pushed the shutter open with his shoulder, just enough to see out. Beyond the sill, the world lay drowned in white. The forest seemed buried up to its waist, the pines huddled under heavy crowns of snow. And yet the wind had eased, the sky a pale gray that hinted at something more merciful above it. Behind him, Elliot stirred. The man groaned as he shifted, dragging his bad leg to the side of the cot. He struggled upright, breathing hard, then reached for a stick of kindling propped against the wall. Daniel stepped forward instinctively, but stopped when Elliot shook his head. Pride still lived strong in that body, battered as it was. Using the stick as a crutch, Elliot pushed himself toward the door. Daniel opened it for him. Together they stepped onto the porch. Cold air knifed in, sharp and clean, but gentler than the night before. Elliot leaned on the railing, staring out at the wide valley, now blanketed in silence. His face was a map of weariness, but in his eyes flickered something different, an odd calm, almost relief. "It's quiet," he rasped, more to himself than anyone. Daniel said nothing. He only stood beside him. "Shh." watching the same white expanse, hearing the same silence. For a moment, he felt as though they were two men at the edge of the world, bound less by words than by the weight of having survived the night. Inside, Raymond had woken too. He sat at the crude wooden table, hands curled around the enamel mug that Daniel had refilled with hot water. He didn't drink at first. He only stared at the rim, his thumb brushing the chipped edge again and again, as though reminding himself that something broken could still hold warmth. The fire had burned down to embers, but Shadow lay close to it, his chest rising steady, his head turned toward the men. His tail swept once across the boards when Daniel entered again, a sound more comforting than words. Daniel busied himself quietly. He set more wood on the fire, listened to the crackle return, then poured hot water into a pot with the last scraps of dried food. The smell was faint, almost nothing, but it spread through the cabin like a reminder of life. When he set the pot on the table, Raymond lifted his eyes. They were tired, rimmed with red, but no longer hollow. He nodded once in Daniel's direction, a small gesture that carried more than thanks. Daniel acknowledged with the same kind of nod, brief, restrained, but heavy with meaning. Shadow rose then, padding to Elliot as the man returned inside, leaning hard on his stick. The shepherd pressed his muzzle against Elliot's hand, warm and firm. Elliot froze for a moment, then let his fingers sink into the fur. His lips moved, the faintest whisper. "Good boy." His voice cracked, softer than it had ever been. Daniel caught it, and something inside him eased, like a knot untied. The cabin settled into quiet again, but it was a different quiet than the night's. Not the suffocating silence of fear, but the fragile stillness of survival. The storm outside had pulled back, and inside something fragile was taking its place. Daniel sat near the fire, hands loose, shoulders heavy but not bowed. He watched the men, one staring into the flames, one staring out the window, and felt something shift in himself. These were strangers, yet the space between them now carried weight. They were no longer just three men and a dog trapped in a storm. They were witnesses to one another's survival, and that mattered. Outside, snow still fell, but gently now, soft spirals drifting down from a sky that hinted at clearing. Light slid through cracks in the shutters, faint gold spilling across the floorboards. Shadow moved into it, lying down where the sun touched, his fur catching sparks of color. His eyes closed halfway, but his ears still twitched, guarding even in rest. Daniel leaned back in the chair and let himself breathe. Not deep, not free, but steadier than before. The night had not broken him, nor the men, nor the dog. The morning was fragile, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt that was enough. By late morning, the snow had softened into a steady drift, no longer the sharp, slashing storm of the night before. Light filtered in pale streaks through the cracks in the shutters, touching the cabin walls with a gray calm. Daniel had risen early. Clearing the porch of heavy snow with a rusted shovel he found leaning against the wall, the rhythmic scrape against wood echoing into the hollow. He worked quietly, each lift of snow more about keeping his body moving than about clearing a path. Inside, the veterans stirred slowly, stiff from the cold that still clung to their bones. Raymond struggled upright first, his movements halting but deliberate. He pushed aside the blanket and sat, shoulders hunched, staring at the rough grain of the table. Daniel crossed to him with the enamel mug filled again with hot water. No words passed between them. Raymond accepted it with both hands, and for a moment he simply sat, eyes lowered, steam fogging his face. Elliot, more stubborn, insisted on pulling himself up using the stick of kindling as a crutch. He planted his good leg firmly and willed his body to rise. Daniel moved as if to help, but Elliot waved him off with a quick jerk of his chin. The pride was raw in him, and Daniel respected it. He stood nearby, watchful, ready, but silent. Elliot wavered, his injured leg trembling, but he steadied himself, gripping the wall until his knuckles blanched. He took one step, then another, halting, labored, but his jaw tightened in determination. Shadow shadowed him, no command needed, padding alongside, his body brushing the man's thigh just enough to steady without crowding. Each time Elliot swayed, the shepherd leaned in, silent ballast. At last, Elliot made it to the chair near the window, collapsing into it with a harsh exhale. His hand dropped to Shadow's head, fingers curling into the thick fur. He muttered something low, words too soft to catch, but Daniel saw the change in his face. Less hardness, more release. By noon, the sound of engines broke the forest's hush. Daniel stepped onto the porch, rifle slung across his back, though he knew it wasn't danger. A bright orange rescue snowcat crawled through the drifts, its tracks carving deep ridges. Another followed, a pair of search and rescue workers visible through the front glass. The storm had kept them at bay all night, but daylight and calmer skies had opened the way. When the door of the first machine swung open, two rescuers hurried forward, their coats dusted white. Daniel raised a hand to slow them, not in refusal, but in caution. "They're alive," he said, voice quiet yet firm. "We'll move slow." Inside, Raymond and Elliot sat ready, or as ready as broken men could be. Daniel helped Raymond first, wrapping a blanket tighter around his shoulders, guiding him toward the porch with an arm steady at his back. The older man's steps were weak, but each one landed, leaving faint impressions in the deep snow. Before he climbed into the rescue vehicle, Raymond paused. His eyes met Daniel's. Not long, not lingering, just one steady look. He gave the faintest nod, a gesture so slight it might have been missed. But Daniel felt it. Acknowledgement. Recognition. "You saw me." That was all it said, all it needed to say. Elliot followed, leaning hard on his makeshift crutch, his face drawn tight with pain. At the step of the snowcat, he faltered. Shadow moved closer, pressing his shoulder against the man's leg. Elliot reached down, his hand trembling as it found the dog's head. He whispered, hoarse, two words Daniel caught this time. "Good boy." The moment lasted only seconds. The rescuers lifted Elliot into the machine, and the door closed behind him. The engines rumbled, tracks churned, and the machines crawled away, carrying the men back toward Helena and the hospital lights of St. Peter's Health. Their tracks cut bold scars through the white, fading only when the forest swallowed them. Daniel stood on the porch long after the sound had vanished, rifle slung loose, shoulders sagging. The wind had stilled, and snowflakes now drifted soft as feathers. He breathed them in, let them melt against his cheeks, and felt the weight of silence again. But this silence was different. Not accusation, not burden. Something gentler. Behind him, Shadow stepped onto the porch, shook snow from his coat, and sat close, pressing his body against Daniel's leg. The shepherd's tail swept once across the boards. Daniel rested his hand on the dog's head. thumb brushing the scar hidden beneath fur. "We did what we could," he murmured. Shadow leaned into the touch, his eyes steady, as if agreeing. The cabin, once filled with fear and fragile breaths, was empty now. Only the fading warmth of the fire remained, and two men's imprints in the blankets they had left behind. Daniel stepped back inside, gathered the mugs, folded the blankets, tidied the room as though returning it to silence. When he closed the door, the cabin felt different, not abandoned, not forgotten. Simply a place that had held life long enough for it to move forward. Daniel stood in the quiet, shadow beside him, and let the weight of it sink in. Two men carried away, broken but alive. A storm survived. A bond deepened between man and dog, between strangers whose eyes had met just long enough to remind each other they existed. Outside, the snow fell softer still, light brightening across the ridge. Daniel and Shadow lingered at the threshold, not speaking, not needing to. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt the quiet as a kind of grace. The cabin was quieter now than it had ever been. With the men gone, the space seemed larger, emptier, its silence no longer crowded with ragged breathing and the shuffle of wounded bodies. Only the memory of them lingered, in the faint indentations left on the cots, in the cooling ash of the fire that had kept them alive, in the chipped mug still resting on the table rimmed faintly with dried coffee. Daniel moved through the room slowly, almost reverently. He gathered the blankets, folded them, and laid them over the back of a chair. He swept the floor of snow that had been tracked in, each scrape of the broom like a soft benediction. There was nothing dramatic in it, nothing heroic. Just care. The simple kind. The kind that said, "This mattered, even if no one would ever see it." Outside, the storm had ended. The world lay wrapped in an almost painful brightness. Every branch and ridge sharpened beneath a new glaze of sunlit snow. The air was so still that sound carried, ravens calling faintly from far off, the creek murmuring under its frozen lid, the gentle shift of ice falling from a pine bough. Daniel stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath his boots, but otherwise the morning gave no resistance. Shadow followed, pressing close enough that his shoulder brushed against Daniel's knee. The shepherd sat when Daniel stopped, tail curling around his paws, nose lifted into the cold air. His coat glowed with threads of bronze where the sunlight touched it, steam rising faintly from his breath. Daniel leaned against the railing, looking out across the endless white. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to do nothing. No patrol, no plan, no rush to prove usefulness. Just stillness. He thought of Raymond's steady eyes before leaving, of Elliot's hand trembling against Shadow's fur, of how survival sometimes came down to the smallest gestures. A blanket pulled tighter, a swallow of water, a dog's head resting on a scar. He felt his throat tighten, but he let it. There was no shame in it. These were not tears of defeat, but of recognition that life was fragile, and yet so stubbornly persistent when given the chance. Shadow shifted, turning his head to press his muzzle into Daniel's palm. The weight was solid, grounding. Daniel let his hand rest there, fingers spread over fur that had carried scars of its own. He thought of how often the dog had done this when grief had been too heavy, always the same message: "Here, stay here." The sunlight climbed higher. Snow crystals glittered as though the forest itself had been dusted with a quiet kind of grace. Daniel drew a long breath, filling his lungs with the sharp, clean air, then released it slowly. For once, he didn't feel the urgency to move, to fill silence with motion. He let it hold him. In the hush of that morning, the lesson came, not shouted, not scripted, but whispered in the stillness. Kindness rarely announces itself. It is carried in the weight of bodies dragged through snow because leaving them would have been easier. In the bitter coffee shared between strangers. In the steadfast presence of a dog who asked for nothing but gave everything. Daniel turned back toward the cabin. The fire had gone out, but the air inside still held its warmth. He gathered his things with unhurried care, slinging his rifle across his back, pulling on gloves stiff with melted snow. Shadow circled once, then settled at his heel, ready without command. Before he closed the door, Daniel looked one last time at the room that had sheltered them. It would stand empty again, forgotten by most, but not by him. For him, it would remain a place where silence had shifted, where lives had been held long enough to move forward. On the porch again, he let his gaze travel across the valley. The sun was brighter now, lighting the snow into a blinding brilliance. For a moment, he felt small against it all. A single figure dwarfed by the sweep of wilderness. But then he felt Shadow lean against his leg, solid, steady, not perfect, not flawless, just present. And that was enough. They walked together round the path carved by the snowcat tracks, prints already softening as new snow dusted the surface. Daniel kept his pace slow, savoring the sound of boots crunching beside paws, the rhythm unbroken, steady. The world would go on, storms would come again, people would falter. But he carried this truth with him now. Sometimes survival is not found in grand rescues or loud declarations, but in the smallest of acts, a hand offered, a head pressed into a palm, a silence shared without fear. As the trees closed around them and the trail dipped toward the road, Daniel glanced down at Shadow. The shepherd met his eyes briefly, tail sweeping once, then returned his gaze to the path ahead. Daniel smiled, faint but real. For the first time in years, he did not feel alone, and in that stillness, with the snow glittering and the air sharp with promise, Daniel understood. What keeps us here is not perfection, but the quiet grace of being enough for each other, for one more day. In the end, the storm passed, but what remained was not the snow. It was the proof that even the smallest acts of kindness can hold another life in place. Daniel and Shadow did not save the world. They simply stayed, carried weight, and reminded two forgotten men that they still mattered. Sometimes that is all any of us can do, be present, steady, and enough. If you believe that quiet compassion can change a life, type Amen in the comments. And tell us, has there been a moment when someone's simple kindness gave you the strength to go on? Share your story below. Your words might be the warmth someone else is waiting for tonight.